And so this meeting is recorded as of now. Everybody, welcome to the Citizen Diplomacy Research Group. My name is Paul Lachelier. I'm the chair of this group, which is part of the Public Diplomacy Council, a US-based nonprofit that is devoted to promoting public diplomacy. We are, if you're new to this group, a group essentially dedicated to connecting citizen diplomacy scholars, students, and practitioners across the world. We hold our meetings every 2 months via Zoom, and anybody can join. It's a free association, and that's pretty much it. We're trying, in essence, to develop understanding and promote the citizen diplomacy sector worldwide. So today, if you are just joining us, the meeting agenda is in the chat. We start with these introductions, and I do encourage you at this point, as I'm talking, to post into the chat bios, 1-paragraph bio about yourself, biographies about yourself, or autobiographies, I guess, and to any links to your personal website, LinkedIn page, or else that you'd like to share, so that we can get a good sense of who's participating. All the notes for this meeting, in other words, the chat notes, will be shared to the wider list, email list. We have an email list of approaching 600 people across the world. This group is clearly a smaller subset of all those who are interested in this. So you'll have the opportunity to just be introduced, not just to this group, but to a larger group. The video, this meeting is video recorded and will be sent and shared via email, and a link to our LinkedIn and Facebook pages. And I think that's pretty much it. So I am going to briefly kind of talk about the agenda. The agenda is typically the same for each meeting. We have two presenters today. Julie Moyes, or Moyes, and I apologize, Julie, if I'm mispronouncing your last name, who is a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer, and she will be talking about soft power and citizen diplomacy more broadly, based on her experience, long experience in the U.S. Foreign Service. And James Ketterer, who is Dean of the School of Continuing Studies at the American University in Cairo, who will be talking about jazz diplomacy, including his own efforts to in the field of jazz diplomacy. That will be followed by a question and answer period, which will be open but moderated. In other words, I encourage you to just raise your hand using the raise your hand button if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. I do encourage you to mute yourself. I'll do my best to mute people who haven't muted themselves, but do mute yourself so that everybody can hear you without distraction. And following the discussion, which will be a 30-minute period, there'll be a space for announcements. We'll talk about the next CDRG dates, and our assistant editor for the CD Bulletin, Tennille Archie, will present the latest Citizen Diplomacy Bulletin, and then we'll open it up to other announcements. So any kind of citizen diplomacy related announcements that you have, please have them prepared for that last part of the meeting. So this meeting will last a total of an hour and a half, and that's it. So without any further ado, please do continue to introduce yourselves via the chat. And Julie, please take it away.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Julie Moyes. My last job in the Foreign Service after 32 years was teaching at the Foreign Service Institute, the State Department Training Center. And can everyone hear me okay? I've got my buds in, so I just want to make sure. Great.
Yes, and I just want to make a note, Julie, as far as I know, you do not have a PowerPoint presentation or
I
anything
do not, no.
Right,
I'm
so you're just going to be talking, just
I'm going to try
FYI.
something a little different today. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I'm kind of reverting to my role as a teacher in that, well, I love seeing your faces. That really, gets me energized. But I'm going to tell you a few stories, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a point of view on how I see soft power in terms of diplomacy. And then we're going to move into a little bit on citizen diplomacy. And I'm going to depend on a lot of you to actually contribute when we have the discussion session, because my experience is not so wide in terms of citizen diplomacy, but I wanted to give you a feel for how soft power is actually used in diplomacy. And I have a theory I want to present to you, and we'll see if you agree, and we'll discuss it if you don't or if you do. But soft power is basically a subject that really excites me, enthralls me. I was always really happy to teach my class, and it's because I've seen soft power at work, and it can be actually pretty magical. If any of you have dealt with groups and exchanges and arts and all of those issues, you know that it can be pretty amazing. So I want to share with you how I see soft power as a practitioner in the diplomatic context, and tell you a few stories to illustrate it. So recently I was thinking about soft power and what soft power is in terms of our objective, in terms of soft power's objective, and in terms of soft power and how it can be used by everyone. And I came to the conclusion that it's basically about building relationships. And that's something that can be applied to just about every aspect of life. I mean, it's something that we use in terms of our personal life, our business life, in terms of our community. And so, that's the way I look at it. And I feel really strongly about it. I mean, we're all familiar with soft power tools. We know all the programs, a lot of efforts in your own work and what you've done with soft power. But I think that really relationships are the foundation, and it's what we hope for in terms of an outcome of our efforts in soft power. So I wanted to share with you, recently when Secretary of State George Shultz died, a lot of people who are eulogizing him actually used a quote of his that relates directly to soft power and diplomacy. And I want to share that with you. And then I will also put it on the Facebook page so you can read it yourself. But George Shultz said, as a Secretary of State, he said, if you plant a garden and go away for 6 months, what have you got when you come back? He said, weeds. And any good gardener knows that you have to clear the weeds out right away. He said, diplomacy is kind of like that. You go around and you talk to people, you develop a relationship of trust and confidence, and then if something comes up, you have that base to work from. So, I mean, that's pretty simple, right? We can all relate to that. It's about developing a relationship of trust. Yourself, if you connect with somebody, if you get to know somebody well, you start to trust them. And, it becomes a really strong connection. And so I wanted to share a couple of stories that kind of illustrate that point. George Mitchell had been U.S. Senator in Maine, and he became a special envoy for the Northern Ireland peace process under the Clinton administration. And when George Mitchell took over, he decided that one of the first things he wanted to do was to bring both sides together at a dinner at the ambassador's residence in London. But he had a few ground rules. He told the visitors or his guests, oops, I'm sorry, but I have got a phone thing that came through. Okay, I'm gonna keep talking here as soon as I can get rid of this promo. Okay. How do I get my picture back? That's the, okay, there we go. Yay. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what that was. It's like a spam call or something. I had my timer going, and that's probably why I came through. So George Mitchell, he did have a few ground rules for this dinner that he had in London. He said, you can talk about, you can talk about sports, you can talk about movies, you can talk about your families, you can talk about travel, but you cannot talk about politics, and you cannot talk about religion. And George Mitchell said in his biography about that period, he said that was really the most important thing that he did in terms of laying the groundwork for successful negotiation. And any of you who know Northern Ireland know that there was a very unlikely friendship that came out of that. And that was with Ian Paisley, who was an Ulsterman, who is sort of a fire and brimstone minister. And he became best buddies with Martin McGuinness, who was in the IRA. So, and I've talked to people since then who said it was true. They were best buddies. They are both deceased now. I don't know where they've gone, Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, but it was a really strong relationship. And those relationships carried through to successful peace negotiation. A similar situation was when I was working in the New York program branch for the International Visitor Program. We had a rabbi from Queens, and he was talking about to a group of West Bank mayors who were international visitors. And he said to them, don't tackle the tough subjects first. He said, find something you have in common. Find some goal, objective that you have in common. And he said, for example, a water supply for your village, or a healthcare system, or something like that. And once you have established that and start working together on something, you've established some trust. And when you have that trust, you can then go on and move on to other things, and have objectives that are that you can both share. So moving into the arts world, and we're going to have a presentation on jazz, and the arts and music are incredibly important in terms of soft power. There have been previous, assistant secretaries for public diplomacy that did not agree. I will not name one, but he did say, I do not want to see one more dance program for exchanges for international visitor program. But dance and jazz and music and arts, things like that, are so incredibly effective. For one thing, they do not depend on language, and it's something that everyone can understand and appreciate. And it's a wonderful way, a lot of times, to reach out to young people who don't have any other means to connect with you. So my favorite story is about a dance company. There was a dance company that the embassy in an unnamed country, I won't go into the country now, but they invited this dance company to come and to go to a part of the country where they had not had much influence or outreach before. And this dance company went to a part of that country, and they connected with a local dance company, and they also got a venue and did all those things and had interpreters. But it was really targeted toward young people. And when they opened the door the first day, there were 200 people waiting to get into this dance workshop. And so they accepted them all in. They accommodated all of them. They worked together. They became very close. They became very good friends. And they did a final production together, which was incredibly successful. And so we found that reaching out to people in that way was incredibly successful. I mean, these are young people. These are the future of that country. These are future leaders of that country in a part of the country where they'd never met an American before. These are subtle things in terms of what we do, but they have enormous impact. Those 200 people in that country are always going to remember meeting Americans, and they're always going to remember a really positive outcome. Now, I think some of you have already been working on exchange programs. I'm not sure, to what extent, or if it's through government or through NGOs, but I don't need to convince anyone about how effective exchange programs are. William Fulbright, who established the Fulbright program, He was a Rhodes Scholar and went to Oxford when he was a young man. And he, after World War II, he was so appalled by Hiroshima and other violent acts during World War II. He thought, we have got to find a way to bring people together and in a peaceful way. And he established the Fulbright program, which he intended to be for, two-way exchange, so that Americans would have a chance to get to know other people and their culture and their values. And he felt that the only way that it would be effective is if it was a full academic year. And he felt it took that kind of time to really get to know each other. And of course, since then, both Democratic and Republican administrations have tried to cut back on that program, and Congress says no way. It is a very popular program. And then we move on to the International Visitor Program, which I worked a lot on. And in one job I had was the director of African programs for the International Visitor Program. And we had a group of African ministers who came to Washington, and they were going to go on a 3-week tour of the United States on the subject of religious tolerance. And they were a diverse group. So even within the group, they were getting to meet people they never would have met otherwise. And there was, a Baptist minister, Catholic priest, and specifically I want to talk to you about an imam. And this imam, we had an opening session with this imam and this other members of the group. And an opening session of an IV program is you go around the table at first and you say, why have you come? What are your interests? What do you want to get from this program? And so we went around the table and we got to this imam. And this imam said, he was very fierce looking. He had a beard, a white robe, and he had sort of a defensive sort of posture. And he said, I preach against your country in my mosque. And we thought, okay, yeah, all right. So we thought, well, we'll see you in 3 weeks. We'll see you at the end of this program. We'll see if you're changed at all about this. I told this story to a group of State Department security officers, and you can imagine what the response was. They said what they said they would have done with a visitor like that. But the fact is that is exactly the kind of visitor we want. He was open-minded enough to accept the invitation. He said he wanted to see for himself. And that's exactly what we want. We don't necessarily want people that totally agree with us or want to come on vacation. So that was an incredibly amazing program. But at the end of the program, we saw him. He said, I was wrong, and I'm going back to my mosque, and I'm going to tell them that that Americans are wonderful people, and that he said, I'm going to go and tell people what it's really like. And I think he really had enormous impact when he got back. He actually did go to his own mosque. He was true to his promise. He went to his own mosque. He talked about American Muslims and their life, and he'd seen some of them and met with some of them in Houston. He actually toured the country and went to other mosques to tell them. And on the night of Benghazi, he went on television with the U.S. ambassador, and he talked about how this is not the way Muslims react. This is not what it means to be, a Muslim. It's not to enact terrorist kind of events. So incredible outcome from that. And I know some of you have your own stories about incredible outcomes from the things you've done, and I, I'd be happy to hear some of those things too. But here's a question. I bet a lot of you know this. When sports diplomacy actually began was basically in the Nixon administration, and it concerned China. And yes, you got it, Brian Smith. It is ping pong diplomacy, and that too wasn't a wonderful thing. I mean, Americans were not well known in China, and this team became such good friends with the Chinese players, and the people who watched it on television got to know the Americans, and they ate up all the stories in the news about the American team. And it was, and Nixon himself, if he were still around, would say that really led to the opening of China. So in other words, the arts and sports And those things actually are openings, and they often are the first thing that we do in the State Department to start making a move toward normalizing relations. And in fact, I'm so sorry.
Julie,
My
Julie,
timer, and I've got it. I'm going over. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay,
yeah.
so
So you have about 30 seconds if you would like to wrap up.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I got sort of engaged in the subject. It was great. So basically, let's talk just briefly about citizen diplomacy. Those are examples of what we do in the State Department, and in terms of what you do, I know that there's so much you can do. You are responsible for going out there and making those connections. We never had more successful thing that we've done than have home hospitality, to have these visitors into homes and have dinner with an American family. And they all say that was a highlight. You are responsible for making friends, having people to your dinner. Maybe you can just go on and share your interests with people. You're a gamer, or you're somebody that works with an NGO. So I just wanted to say that the world is smaller now. We have no limitations on what we can do. Governments no longer have control over social media. Governments are small players now in terms of citizen diplomacy. It's a growing field. It'll keep growing bigger and bigger, and each one of us has a role to play. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Julie. I just want to remind everybody who has not introduced themselves, please do so via the chat. Also, some people are already doing so, and I encourage everybody to do so. If you have thoughts, you have questions, comments, by all means, use the chat. Again, those will be shared with the larger email group after this meeting. So now we have James Ketterer, who will be talking about jazz diplomacy, and he has a PowerPoint presentation, which James, you should be able to share. So go right ahead and open that up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Julie. That was a great presentation and certainly teased me up to talk about this more specific thing. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right. This is just, there we go. Okay, everyone can see that and everyone can hear me? Yes, I hope. Paul, I can't hear you. You're saying something, but.
Hold on a second. If you're looking for the presentation button, it's at the
Yeah,
bottom of your.
Right, I got
You
it.
got it.
Just didn't do it. There we go. Just want to make sure everybody could hear me. Okay. So I'll just dive right in because I know time is limited, and what I really want to talk about is not just the specifics of jazz diplomacy. I hope you're all jazz fans in some level or not, but I know you're all diplomacy fans. So I think the key thing that I want to get across is that, using jazz diplomacy as a case study for diplomacy in general, and for a lot of the things that Julie was just talking about. And this is going to focus on a very specific time in the United States, but I'd like to talk about broader messages about diplomacy, both that states are engaged in, but also that citizens are engaged in. And I think this is an example where they come together in a good way. You see these 4 bullet points of things I want to focus on, that there's a real you're representing something here, in this case, there's some specific goals and values, and that there's an honest portrayal of, in this case, the United States. This is US jazz diplomacy. And you're showing, as a former mentor of mine, some people on this call may know him, he's sort of a legend in public diplomacy, Ambassador Robert Gosende. He always said to us, we have to show the good, the bad, and the ugly, because we have to show everything and let people sort it out for themselves, like that imam did in Julie's case. Otherwise, it's just a propaganda story. The third thing is that in jazz diplomacy, as in diplomacy in general, having a good ear is as important as having a good story, and bringing lessons home, and then also leaving a legacy. That garden that Secretary Schultz talked about will be tended by someone else after you leave. Okay, this is, there we go. So on the jazz diplomacy story, from my starting point, it really starts with someone who wasn't at the time in the State Department, wasn't technically a diplomat. He was a member of Congress representing Harlem, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And he was involved in conversations where people were saying, you know, the Soviets are really killing us on propaganda. The Soviets are pointing out all of the flaws of the United States. They're pointing out the deep hypocrisy of the United States and making it much more difficult for us to get across the kind of message that we want to get across. And Powell was, of course, not only representing his district, but he was probably the most prominent African-American politician at the time. And he was saying, you know, we've got something that's centered in Harlem, but that's deeply American and that represents the best of not just African Americans, but of America, and that we ought to be promoting that in a certain way. And that is jazz. And this is happening at the same time, and this is jumping a little ahead in the story, but this picture, there's so many pictures from this time of the civil rights movement. It's the integration of the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. People, you can see the woman screaming at the young woman who's walking to school. Just, you know, these searing kind of difficult images all the time that were being broadcast around the world. And at the same time, so we heard of an example of sports diplomacy, the role of sports for just kind of creating symbols of important moments, of kind of bookmarking historical periods. And this was a big one. So for those of you on the call who are not American and don't care at all about either jazz or baseball, baseball is not only a distinctly American sport. And another presentation I could give, I could talk about how it is becoming an increasingly global sport. But in the 1940s and 50s, following World War II, immediately following World War II, it was the dominant sport in the United States. And it was a segregated sport. Like much of American life was segregated. And a team in New York City, the Brooklyn Dodgers, had the first African-American player, who you can see here in the Dodgers uniform, Jackie Robinson. And this was a deeply important moment for the U.S., for New York City as well. And sports was kind of ahead of the curve. This was several years ahead of some of the major events in the civil rights movement. So things were changing, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. And jazz itself, and this gets to my first bullet point, was you're trying to represent, you're not just trying to say, okay, let's send a music group and have them play some music, and won't that be a wonderful thing? But particularly with jazz, and this is one of the things that Congressman Powell was talking about, is that the way the music itself is constructed is in itself democratic. And by that I mean, in my other life, I'm a jazz drummer. I've played times with musicians where I don't know them. We're not getting together with rehearsed pieces of music, but before a particular song starts, somebody will say, we're going to do this song. Maybe we have music, maybe we don't. And people will agree upon certain parameters of it: the tempo, the format of the song has a written chordal structure, etc. That's very similar to kind of, one could say, a constitution. And then within that constitution, everyone gets their say. Or within a jazz piece, everyone gets a moment when they can shine, when their voice is out front, when they're soloing in the parameters set by that form of the music. And we can see here, these are some very famous musicians playing in this quartet, that jazz, though it was not always perfectly integrated, that's for sure, it was, again, ahead of the curve a bit in integration of some of the bands, not all, but there were elements of it that was representing something that was, number one, countering what the Soviets were saying, and number two, drawing on those values that were meant to be projected. Now, this is one of the most famous photos of this particular period of jazz, and this takes place in Harlem. And some of the best jazz musicians alive at the time are in this photo. There's actually a very interesting documentary made about the taking of this photo that I think you can find on YouTube. It's just 10 minutes long. But one of the things that amuses me, knowing jazz musicians, I'm also the son of a jazz musician, um, is that they had to take the photo early in the morning when the musicians were on their way back from their gigs, because rounding them up otherwise would have been very, very difficult. Anyway, it really captures a time in the art form, but it also captures a time in Harlem, um, building upon the previous decades of the Harlem Renaissance and this flowering of African American culture in many different manifestations, not just in music. One of those who was at the forefront of this was Duke Ellington, who, like many who were at the forefront of this art form in New York City and then worldwide, were not native New Yorkers. Ellington was from Washington, D.C., but he really he lived in New York, and he really, came to represent this essence of Harlem and of the music. And this is the Apollo Theater, which is one of the famous venues, famous in the world, but also located on 125th Street in Harlem. And so his band was famous for decades before we get to this moment of jazz diplomacy. This is another one of the famous musicians who was put on tour, a younger musician, the guy on the motorcycle, Dizzy Gillespie. And we'll talk about him and Ellington in a bit. And this picture is actually taken on one of those tours. And I think it just very nicely captures these moments of spontaneous enthusiasm. Now, I have to say, just to I'll put on my political scientist hat for a moment, and somebody who worked in the US government for a while too, that people would often refer to these eventually as, and they State Department tours. And yes, the State Department had a great role in them, uh, particularly starting them. But the US Information Agency for its life really was at the center of a lot of this and developing it into something that still sustains itself today, even though US Information Agency does not. It stopped existing in 1998 when people thought the Cold War was over and we didn't need such an institution. That's yet another presentation I could give where I happen to think that's not true. But anyway, I just want to give that moment of recognition for what USIA did with these programs over many, many, many years, and not always on the level of Duke Ellington, but just bands coming and going and being programmed and doing wonderful work. Now, also, it's not just performances, and the Voice of America had a tremendously important role in all of this. And this particular show with jazz was this Wallace Conover, a very famous DJ of jazz. And I mean, this he took on kind of legendary status. People who would hear his voice, and I've met people throughout the years whose first real taste of American culture, even if they didn't like American policies at all, was through the voice of Wallace Conover and the music that they would hear from him. And this is something that still kind of resonates around the world if you meet people who are old enough to remember those times. One of those fans, just by the way, of jazz, who later people, when they heard that he was a fan of jazz, said, maybe this is a guy we could work with, was Mikhail Gorbachev. So Louis Armstrong really kind of, I think in many ways, is is at the center of a piece of this story in this particular time period, because he was already a huge star, and he was a star whose appeal crossed racial boundaries, and had this magnetic personality, and also performed music that appealed to lots of people who might maybe wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as sort of sophisticated, highbrow jazz listeners. So he would sing as well as play his instrument, and he really connected jazz all the way back to his hometown of New Orleans, to his adopted city of New York, and to this world status as a musician.
James, you've got 3 minutes.
Okay, again, so how does somebody like Armstrong do this at the time when they're, how does he rectify, how does he justify doing this when there's really a deep racism in the United States? And I'm going to skip over this because we don't have time to read these things. I would just say that he found a way to do it by being, again, show the good, the bad, and the ugly. He would perform music that would reveal what was really happening in the United States to audiences around the world, but at the same time doing it kind of as an ambassadorial representative. A couple points I want to make very quickly. When you send these great musicians overseas to listen, to play this music, they also have great ears. They're listening to music. They heard other music around the world. They recorded it. They brought it back to the United States in a way that Americans would have never heard it before, including this band, Dave Brubeck, who did this, an integrated band. He was famous for finding rhythms and harmonies and melodies from around the world and integrating them into his own music and playing them again at home for American audiences. Just put Van Cliburn in here to show this wasn't just jazz musicians who did it. Others did it too in different ways, in enormously successful ways. And then just last, I would say, I'll end with these. It continues on, not always at the same level that was happening before. Here's some of the programs I worked on in Cairo, in my first time in Cairo, and very, very successful. The last point I'm going to make, and Paul, then I promise I'm going to end, is this idea of leaving a legacy. And there are bands like my friend's band, very famous band in Cairo, Efta Cassette. They are Egyptian musicians who grew up hearing American musicians on tour, American radio, and other things, and they have integrated it into their own cultures and their own music, tending their own garden, as Secretary Schultz would have said, in a new sort of citizen diplomatic way. And I will just leave it with that great famous photo. Thank you very much.
Awesome, James. Thank you. So we're gonna exit full screen and return to our conversation. James, if you want to just stop your presentation. And we're now going to open it up. We've got 30 minutes of open discussion about the presentations. So it can be both questions and comments. And you are welcome to ask not just softball questions, but hardball questions. And if you don't ask the hardball questions, I might ask the hardball questions.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I am Marissa Donis. I'm a U.S. lobbyist, citizen diplomat, and founder of MTA Visions. We're a global corporate social responsibility and government relations firm based in D.C. that curate international diplomacy programs across the globe. Thank you so much for this wonderful platform and to our amazing speakers for today. My first question is for our first speaker on soft diplomacy, who gave us quite a few of great examples of how soft diplomacy has really served as the backbone of diplomacy writ large. And so the question that I have, and I'm actually writing a piece on this now for the blog, is do you believe that soft diplomacy is just citizen diplomacy?
Interesting question. Yeah, I could hear you. Thank you. So, soft power is diplomacy, and some politicians don't like soft power because they think that there's Joseph Nye talks a great deal about the carrot and the stick. I mean, do we want it to get basically Joseph Nye famous quote is that we don't want to get people to do what we want them to do. We want them to want what we want. And so I agree that it is part of diplomacy writ large. I mean, that is behind diplomacy is we try to avoid using military force and sanctions if we possibly can. But in terms of, I mean, I think it's all citizen diplomacy. You're right, because it is honestly, for the international visitors, it's honestly that person-to-person contact they have with Americans in their homes that has the biggest impact. And obviously there's a role to play for diplomats who make contacts, make trust and connections with other people. But I mean, we all have a role to play in it. And as governments stop doing as much in terms of soft power, it's up to private citizens to stand up and take a role and start engaging with other audiences, with international contacts, and try to bring about a more peaceful world in their own individual way. One handshake at a time, as Edward R. Murrow would say. I hope I answered that. If I didn't, call me on it.
No, that was great. I just wanted you to support my premise for the blog that's coming out. Thank you so much, Julie.
Okay, good.
And can you elaborate on your premise for your blog a little bit? I don't know.
Sure thing, Paul. I would rather publish it next week, but I'm more than happy to share. So I'm writing a series of blog posts on the new age of diplomacy, focusing on the intersections between the youth, the millennial generation, specifically religion, local diplomacy. And so we're looking at ways of renovating, so to speak. And so one of the articles that we're writing on now is essentially just redefining some of the key terms that we've used over time in diplomacy. So for example, soft diplomacy, we want to set up the premise that soft diplomacy is actually citizen diplomacy, because oftentimes, even though you might be operating in your professional capacity, we're not utilizing the usual professional means. So for example, if I'm a diplomat and my role is to represent the interests of my country as it pertains to matters of trade, when I'm operating in the soft diplomacy perspective, I won't talk about trade. I'll talk about music, I'll talk about sports, or I'll talk about some other common interest. And at that point, although I might be a diplomat, I'm actually operating from the mindset of a citizen, in which that's the premise that I'm presenting, is that soft diplomacy is citizen diplomacy. So I just gave away my article, but I'll share more with you guys. More than happy to circulate it in the listserv to present that perspective. So again, thank you, Paul, for creating this amazing network. It's so timely for the world right now. So thank you so much.
Great. And I'll share it at the end of our meeting, the Facebook and the LinkedIn groups through which you can share some of your work on citizen diplomacy. If I'm sure you're already part of them, but for others who may not be. So we have a series of questions here in the chat for James about jazz diplomacy. Linda Staley says, do you see jazz helping to build relations with countries like Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Syria? And Barbara Keller says, how has music diplomacy been continuing during the pandemic, and how do you see it continuing virtually once travel is possible again?
So on the first one, I guess maybe the question is about how to work with countries where the U.S. has a very adversarial relationship with, and I do think that it can create all sorts of possible links that might not be possible otherwise. I just have a very, very quick anecdote about Iran. So I gave a similar kind of talk, though longer and with lots of videos and things like that, and Louis Armstrong performances on video. I gave it in Santa Barbara, California, a few years ago. And during the Q&A section, somebody stood up and said, well, I don't really have a question, but I want to say something. And that's usually a bad start to something. And it was quite an older guy. And his story basically was that he was a young boy and Duke Ellington's band came to his town, and he didn't have enough money. as this young boy to go, but he knew this was some sort of excitement. He didn't know who Duke Ellington was. He didn't really know who the United States was, but he went down, he listened to through the fence at this stadium, and he heard this incredible music, and it was just so wild and different. And so he went home and told his parents about it, and they sent him to something we used to do a lot more that we don't do now. They sent him to the American Library, and the American Library gave him some materials to read. And he said one of the things they gave him was, for some reason, I don't know why, a copy of the Gettysburg Address. And here we are in Santa Barbara in 2017 or 18. He pulls out that copy, that very copy they gave him in Iran those decades before. And he said he never would have moved to the United States, gotten his PhD, started a family, if it hadn't been for that thing that piqued his curiosity. So finding a way to do that. I would also say too, that it's not always jazz. It's not always going to be jazz in the way at the forefront as the particular kind of music. So if there are different ways to reach different audiences in, let's say, Cuba or Iran, then that's also something that should be considered in the toolbox of diplomacy. Um, and that doesn't quite answer the question, because it's this intersection of state and citizen. So if you're doing it on behalf of the United States, you're still bounded by those things that might make it more difficult at kind of high levels of diplomacy to work in countries where the relations are still quite bad, or where we have no relations whatsoever.
There's a further question from Carson. How about musicians who want to do global work? How can they get themselves involved and supported? I guess this is a question about, in part, perhaps about government funding for jazz diplomacy and
Yeah.
other forms of cultural diplomacy.
So I can speak to that. I also didn't answer the question about virtual. Will virtual continue, and what's been happening now? I can just say in Egypt, all of the in-person programs have been totally closed down. The things I even though I'm not working for the U.S. government now, I work at the American University, and we do a lot of work with the embassy on these sorts of things, and nothing has happened. Um, I'm not even aware. I'm trying to think if there's been virtual performances. Maybe there's been some virtual regional English language office things, but I'm not sure. And I personally hope, as I'm a little. It's nice to see you all on Zoom, but I'm a little sick of virtual everything. That we get back to some real in-person jazz performances and let jazz musicians not just. And here's a key thing too, that when you bring a band to the country, you don't want them to just give a performance, get on a plane and leave. You want them to stay for a few days, have workshops with students, meet other musicians, meet other people, get out of the capital city, do all the things that would allow it to really have have deeper roots than it would. That's very hard virtually. In terms of musicians, how they can get involved. So, the US, I'm going to sound critical because I am a little critical of this. We get into these modes at times. It goes in cycles where we like to contract a lot of things out, and this is one of those things that has often been contracted out a lot. What the selection of musicians and how they're going to go and where they're going to go. In reality, it's really kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes embassies will jump in and do it themselves if they have officers at post who really know it and care about it. So there are ways that musicians can apply through the contractor route. And then there's sort of the informal ways where you can kind of get to know certain foreign service officers and certain posts who are active at it. There are also, and this gets, I think, to the citizen issue, there are jazz organizations that do it on their own without government involvement. And those, I think, have gotten much, much better than they were before. In the days of
That's
Louis
the avenue
Armstrong,
I was
you
really
either
aiming
had to
at.
have a promoter sending you overseas or the State Department. Now there are groups that are doing it pretty well. I mean, quite a
That's what
number
I
of
was
them
asking
actually.
about, is where's the on-ramp for those groups? Because
Mm,
like you said, it is the fact that there's this contracting out. I've been to so many public diplomacy sponsored events where the artist doesn't get it, but yet you go to the individually inspired events, and you realize this is what everybody needs to listen to, but it's a small thing because people don't have a good on-ramp for being recognized for what they're
Yeah.
trying to do personally and genuinely.
Carson, I would say, I mean, you really have touched upon such a key issue. And again, we can look at kind of cultural diplomacy or specifically musical diplomacy as a case study for a broader issue. I think the contracting out can have its appropriate function at times, but it's been overdone, in my personal opinion, many times. And then you end up exactly with the outcomes that you're talking about, Carson. And so I would like to see it changed. I'd like to see a lot more of it drawn back into the United States. And I think the answer to it is make sure you hire and train foreign service officers who know, care, and value this function so they can do it and you don't need to contract it out. How's that for a lot of a radical message all wrapped into one?
And
Right.
James, if you do have organizations that you can recommend, if you can put that in the chat, that
I'm
are
gonna
in
need to,
fact,
I'm gonna need to look them up, Paul. Maybe I can
gotcha.
then email them to you and you can share them with the group later.
Yeah,
I
or
just
you
don't
can
have them off the top
simply
of my
you can
head.
simply share them on the Facebook or the LinkedIn group. But you can pass it to me if you'd like, and I can share it to there.
Yeah,
So we've got some comments and questions in the chat, but Chirunim
I'd like to
Agioto
suggest,
from Nigeria has had his hand raised for a little while. So I want to give him the opportunity to ask a question or make a comment.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Paul, and I'm really happy to be part of this dialogue. And my question is to Julie. It is a common thing these days for the media in nations like United States and Britain to overemphasize problems in Africa, problems such as terrorism or cybercrime. And we are not ignorant of the extent to which these kind of stories affect the notions and the way the rest of the world perceive African nations. So, given this, to what extent can soft power diplomacy make significant effects when there is a deliberate counter
I think you broke up at the
approach
end
by the
there.
Western media?
Yeah, so I think just to go ahead, Chirunim, when there's a deliberate effort to
When there
what?
is a deliberate counter approach by the Western media, to what extent can soft power diplomacy make significant effects?
Okay. So the question is about soft power and consistent efforts in Africa. And there is a lot we've done in Africa, but it is a two-way street. And as the story about the imam showed, there has to be a willingness too for people to engage with the U.S. And I think most Africans do seem quite pleased to engage with the U.S. And I know embassies work very hard to maintain those contacts as well. But I don't think I quite answered your question.
I think what Chirunim is trying to get at, and this to me is a good kind of hardball question in some sense, and I don't mean hardball necessarily, but we do need to be asking ourselves these questions, right? And this time around, it's great. We're getting two American perspectives, but I want to encourage, and I'll say this again towards the end. We do want to hear from citizen diplomats, scholars, students, and practitioners throughout the world. So we will, in subsequent meetings, have speakers from other parts of the world. But I think Chirunim is getting at this important issue of who in the cultural diplomacy or and more broadly the citizen diplomacy space has more voice, who gets heard more. And it seems that Americans have an outsized role, and other powers that invest through their governments in citizen diplomacy for their own particular purposes, right? And so, and it sounds like if I'm representing Chirunim correctly, that there is that Africans feel like their own voices are not heard enough, and how can that ground be leveled? And Shirunim, I don't know if I'm doing justice to what you were asking.
You did, but it's really a very direct question, which it's, we these days, coming from Africa, you see the Western media. I don't want to mention particular medias, but you see stories where they overemphasize problems in Africa, like terrorism and cybercrime, which we know exist in other parts of the world, but they emphasize more on Africa. And we know how these stories affect the notions and the way African countries are perceived by the rest of the world. Yeah, so given this, when there is a deliberate effort by the Western media to counter approaches in Africa, how can soft power diplomacy help this? To what extent can it make significant effect, given that there is a deliberate counter approach by the Western media?
I mean, your problem basically is that African voices are not getting heard through mainstream U.S. and international media, and some of the rest of you may have suggestions on how that can be amplified a bit. But we all have access now to social media, and thinking in terms of ways you can get your story out there. And I would welcome any suggestions the rest of this group may have in terms of getting a story out there when it's not getting played up in the international press, and you want to get your voice heard.
I just want to quickly add, and jumping off of what James mentioned about the democratic ethos of jazz, that everybody gets a chance to express to have their moment, their solo moment within a jazz performance, and perhaps that model, right, that ethic that everybody gets a chance to have their voice heard. In the context of citizen diplomacy is perhaps kind of a good model for addressing what Shirunim is raising, but I wonder what others think. And we'd love to hear also from others. I really appreciate Shirunim speaking up, others from other parts of the world. I do want to mention we have one of our former speakers from Iran, because Iran, I think, has been mentioned a couple of times, but Mohsen Amin is in on our meeting from Tehran. I wonder if he has any thoughts, or anybody else. Oh, Mohsen, you need to unmute.
Hello, everybody.
We can hear you.
Thank you. I just have a question from James. Thank you, James. I want to ask you from the music diplomacy, general diplomacy, and the section or the affection of music diplomacy in other regions of the world. For example, I want to ask you, can you see any opportunities for Eastern music, Eastern types of music for cultural or citizen diplomacy, or it's especially for Western types of music?
Yes, thank you. I touched upon that briefly, but I had already gotten the 2-minute warning from Paul when I was on that subject, so I went over it much more quickly than I normally would have, and I'll again be quick, Paul, but I will touch on a little bit more. So, the thing is, the way that musicians work, governments can send them out there with all sorts of governmental goals and etc. Do what governments do. But musicians will do what musicians do. They will gather with other musicians, they will learn from each other, and they will integrate each other's forms of music across all sorts of boundaries, both political boundaries, geographic boundaries, and time as well. So you know, one of the images that I showed was an album that Duke Ellington, he composed all the music based upon his time traveling through various parts of Asia and the Middle East, including in Iran. One of the most beautiful songs on that particular album is inspired by his concert in Isfahan, which happens to be the very same concert that kid was listening through the fence. The very same concert. He was only there once. So he wrote this song, Isfahan. And that and the Dave Brubeck Quartet and others are bringing this into the American context. However, it's going the other way too. We have great stories of South African musicians who developed all kinds of interests in American jazz, but integrated it into the South African context in the worst days of apartheid as well. And I told you about my friend who has the band in Cairo, Iftikasat. That's one of many. I should also say too that one thing that the U.S. government has done, and other governments do quite a lot too, is, you know, sending, in my case now, Egyptian musicians to the United States on tour, so Americans can hear Egyptian musicians singing in Arabic, playing their music as they've composed it and conceived of it. So I think, you know, you can't rein in musicians. I have endless optimism about their willingness to break boundaries and to cooperate with each other, not in a way of kind of global domination of one culture and cultural appropriation, but really just when you think about a group of jazz musicians in a room, they're just going to do what they do. And it's wonderful. It's exactly what you want in citizen diplomacy. Let them loose and let them do it. I hope that answers your question. I'm an optimist, so we'll leave it on an optimistic note.
Great. We have the ambassador from St. Lucia has a question.
Hello, good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, all. My name is Jocelyn Fletcher. Mike, I want to support the gentleman from Nigeria who asked the question about false information. And of course, I'm coming from the island of St. Lucia. And what he was saying is so poignant because we have a similar issue, Julie, when it relates to.
Oh, if whoever has their volume on, if you could mute. I'm trying to find the person to mute them. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, when we look at with us, our country, there was just a domestic issue in our island, which was totally erroneous in the way the Americans picked it up. And as a result of their false understanding of the whole situation, they have resisted or blocked for years the support that they gave to our police force. This has affected because they used to offer a lot of training and a lot of give our police force a lot of support. All of that has stopped for years, and our government after government have changed. I mean, we're not very we don't have much problems with governments in our country. We only have two parties, and one stayed for many years. They shift to another one, and they back to the same one. And so they've been trying to negotiate using all kind of diplomatic thing with the Americans to change that attitude. But they want to impose rules, impose their own thing upon those islands. I mean, how do you go around something like that, Julie? Thank you.
Julie? You're on mute. Oh, we still can't hear you.
I'm not sure I have any more to add to that because, you know, what's coming out in the U.S. international press is not something I have a whole lot of, you know, control over. But, you know, I'm totally sympathize with it. And if I were given, you know, if I were given some time to seriously think about it, perhaps I could come up with some suggestions. But right on the fly, I'm afraid I'm not particularly good at that. And I'm hoping maybe James might have some ideas, or some of the others. I know there's some other people in this group that are well experienced with the international press. I mean, Mike Anderson, maybe you want to say something, Mike? I'm making my call to whomever wants to.
I'm happy to share as well too, Julie.
What's that?
Hi, this is Marissa. I'm happy to provide a perspective as well.
So, Michael Anderson, I don't know if you're listening or hearing.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Mike, if you're there? No, I guess not.
Okay.
So yeah, as I said, I'm an introvert, so it actually takes me time to come up to sit down and think things through. So I don't have an immediate answer, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
So I guess, one thing I would add to this conversation, it seems like there are government perspectives and government agendas, and then there are citizen perspectives and citizen agendas, and those two things don't necessarily coincide, particularly perhaps in authoritarian regimes. And so I guess part of the issue is in citizen diplomacy, who are we hearing from, right? Who are we hearing from? Governments that are using citizen diplomacy to shine a positive light on their countries, or are we hearing from citizen diplomats who may have a very different perspective from their governments?
Yeah. I mean, there's one example that I've heard, and it was many years ago, but in China, there was a train crash, and the Chinese government, as was their form in those days, was to totally try to, black it out, and nobody knew anything about it. However, there were people with phones, and people took pictures, and people actually got on Facebook and on Twitter. And so the power of a country to control that message is a lot more limited now than it used to be, because everyone has access to these means. And the problem also is that with so many people having access, that there's too much noise. I mean, it makes it hard for everyone to get their message out. There's just a lot of noise. The only thing I can think of is to develop a good relationship with the foreign press in your country, and making sure that's your story gets out to a broader assortment of people. But it's hard. It's a hard question. I really I totally understand, totally empathize with that situation. But it is changing, and then we have some power ourselves to actually reach out directly and not depend so much on media. I mean, mainstream media is losing power. I mean, it's going to social media. Governments don't have the impact they had before, because there are too many competing voices, I think.
We're going to give time for just one more question that just came in from Arnaud Guif. If you can introduce yourself and your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Arnau. I work for the province of Barcelona, which is a region inside Catalonia, and more specifically the Brussels office that we have. And I have a question, or rather I would like to know her thoughts for Julie, for Ms. Moyes, regarding the role of the cities and local authorities in designing and implementing soft power strategies. Because now when I was listening to Mr. Lachelier, I was thinking about this role that cities, at least in Europe, have many times in building that bridge between the public authorities and citizenship and the people. And we've seen that in the Mediterranean, particularly in the northern Mediterranean, in which the states do not get along at all, but the cities can fill in and can actually provide some nice way outs for particular problems, like for example, refugees and the migration crisis. So my question, or what I would like to know if it's possible, would be that if the United States have a particular strategy or have a particular coordination mechanism with its cities and local authorities, and if that's so, And how do the US engage these local authorities in these strategies in order to be more influent and to carry out their strategies and thus enhancing the overall soft power? Thank you very much.
Right. You know, that I can't cite any examples right now specifically in terms of cities that have been involved in it, but I do know that the US government has been trying to get out of the capital, trying to reach out to the cities. I know foreign service officers that are working very hard. One person I know who's working in Portugal, and they're setting up American spaces, they call them, or spaces where they can actually host events, invite people, things like that. And it's increasingly become very popular to get out of the city, to listen to people outside the city, to have contacts in other cities outside of the capital. And I know that that is going on. But you know, in terms of other I mean, individually, if there is an issue in a city and the US government as a whole takes an interest in it, obviously they'll be reaching out directly to that city. But in terms of foreign policy, it is often geared more toward you know, foreign policy and the central government. But it's what public diplomacy sections overseas are the ones that are actually reaching out, traveling around your country, hosting speakers in your city, you know, and getting together with people. Now, if you had a proposal of some sort for a speaker that you wanted to hear from the US, or if you had a particular project you wanted to, you know, jointly work with the embassy on, that sort of thing, your public diplomacy section is going to be the section that is involved with any outreach in terms of the public in general. Now, the outreach in terms of the officials would probably be, you know, political officers, people like that. So it's, but I think, you know, your first stop could be the public diplomacy section if you have an idea that you want to propose to somebody.
Oh, could I just mention something about this too?
Yes.
No, I think you're also asking about what do American cities do, and are they coordinated at all by the State Department? Is there a coordinated approach to kind of this? And I can speak to this because I've worked on this on the state and city level in the U.S. And so, you know, the difficult thing about the United States system or lack of system for many non-Americans or even Americans to kind of get their head around is that it's incredibly decentralized. But that's also the beneficial thing of it. So my home city of New York is heavily involved in a variety of worldwide issues that, because it's New York, that sometimes are in coordination with the US government. And honestly, sometimes they're doing it on their own. That can be, you know, issues of, you know, in New York taking its own positions on climate change. New York not taking its own policy positions, but sending its own messages on questions of immigration issues, refugee, asylum sorts of things. Certainly on trade. This is one area where the states and cities are heavily involved in projecting their own message and their own power out in a way that's separate from whatever the State Department does in Washington. And so, you know, I would say that, no, it's not really heavily centralized, nor should it be, nor could it be, because the American system is so unbelievably decentralized. It tends to be pretty centralized under our Constitution and system in terms of foreign policy. But even in that area, I would say even in the city of New York following 9/11, New York basically, you know, it was coordinating with Washington, but it decided to send its own New York police representatives around the world to monitor and be involved in counterterrorism efforts. So big cities do this a lot. Big and medium-sized states do a lot of trade issues, and the sister city relationships allow for lots of channels of cultural and educational exchanges as well. And I see Julie nodding there, because I'm sure she's worked on many of those sister city issues, which are like gold, I think.
And actually, there was a comment here from Linda, who was also mentioned Global Ties, which works in about 80, 90 cities in the United States, and they host international visitors, but they also put on venues and programs and that sort of thing. And so that in terms of any formal networks, I'd say you have sister cities and you have Global Ties as organizations that are involved with the international side of things in the U.S. So.
Great. So I was struck, actually, Arnaud, in response to your question, I was struck by when I found out recently there was a list of associations of cities across the world, and it's remarkable, and you are probably well aware of it. There are a large number of associations of cities across the world working together on different issues, including climate change, and in fact. So the next meeting of the CDRG, which will be in early June, in fact, will have a presentation about city level diplomacy from somebody from Romania. So by all means, participate in that discussion. So we need to move on to the rest of our meeting, which is announcements. And I need to briefly mention to you all that we in my last email to the group, it was a forwarding of the reminder of this meeting, but also it included a survey, which for those of you who have not participated in the surveys yet, I would encourage you to fill out the survey, because we need to figure out essentially the timing of our next meeting. So our meetings happen every 2 months via Zoom, typically towards the beginning of the month, but because we come from all kinds of different time zones, and it's a challenge to get people from Asian time zones. We have so far alternated our meetings between 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. Eastern time here in the United States in Washington, D.C. However, we're trying to accommodate as much as possible as many people across the world. So please do respond to the survey, because among the questions that we have are a question about what's a good timing for you. And there are also other questions about the kinds of content that you would like to have presented at these meetings, the kinds of topics that we should be addressing. So please fill out the survey. And if you're interested in presenting, when you fill out the survey, there's an opportunity for you to explain what you would like to present on, because we would love to hear from a variety of voices wherever you are in the world. So with that said, I'm going to pass things on to Tennille Archie, who has very kindly over the last several weeks worked with me to put out the most recent issue of the Citizen Diplomacy Bulletin, which is essentially news about our citizen diplomacy sector worldwide.
Thank you. I could share my screen.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to thank Julie and James for their presentation, and I really, really enjoyed it, and it was married together so perfectly. Yeah, so the feature article for this issue was a piece from Modern Diplomacy there, and it's followed by a few announcements from the top of page 2 and the ending of page 2 into page 3. We have some really interesting articles. And the ending of page 3, it takes us to some book choices that I hope you really enjoy reading. And to conclude from pages 4 to 6, we have some helpful resources that you might be interested in. You can check it out if you're looking for like information, materials, or organizations in the area of diplomacy. Yeah, and that's it.
Great.
Yeah.
So Tennille, thank you for helping to put this together. We will be posting the latest bulletin to our Facebook and LinkedIn pages so that you can get to read it. I want to reiterate that the bulletin is an opportunity to reach a broader audience, because of course these meetings reach about typically we have between 30 and 40 people who attend these particular meetings, but we have a much broader network, not just on the email list, which reaches about 600, close to 600 people worldwide and is growing, but also through our LinkedIn group and the Facebook group, we're also reaching other people who are not on the email list. So I do encourage you to submit announcements that you have about citizen diplomacy related initiatives to us so that we can include it in the bulletin. We are on to open kind of announcements with regards to anything that you have going on in citizen diplomacy. I'll mention briefly, my own organization, Learning Life, is doing a family diplomacy initiative. It's an ongoing program that we have, and we have a series of live international family dialogues that are happening with families across the world in June through November of this year. And I'm going to post into the chat a link for more information, but we are looking for family diplomats and for family diplomacy ambassadors to join in our work. And the link will have details about what that means for those who are interested. Any other announcements?
Would it be appropriate at the next one, Paul, to just simply make an announcement about an online China cabinet meeting if people wanted to join? I'm not prepared to give a full announcement right now. Curious if that's what you're talking about.
Well, if it is a citizen diplomacy event, then absolutely.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. And if you have any information about it now, you can feel free to share it in preparation for, I guess, a more formal announcement later.
The website that I shared, TinyInitiative.org, in the chat is a way where you can find the links to join an online discussion about American-China relations with young people. We're going to have one on Tuesday afternoons and Wednesday afternoons.
Great. Thanks, Carson. Linda, you have an announcement?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for this. We are launching a documentary on science engagement with North Korea that will be up on this website in about 3 weeks. If you're interested, just go there and it'll be under initiatives.
Great. Thanks, Linda. Any other announcements?
Hi, I have an announcement. This is Marissa. As I shared earlier, I manage MTA Vision. We help curate citizen diplomacy programs with NGOs and governments and corporations. We just launched our next phase of our Youth Leading Now, which is a program that's currently training youth between the ages of 18 and 35 in about 7 countries to actually enter their diplomatic corps as a youth. We also have our city diplomacy program that launched last year. We're now moving into phase 3, where we partnered about 30 different cities in the United States and cities globally to work on different partnerships and cooperations, vis-a-vis virtual culture diplomacy programs, trade agreements, vast engagement in 2 regions. We focused on Asia, well, 3 regions, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And we have our upcoming Citizen Diplomacy Summit for local government that's coming out on June 7th through 9th. And I'll forward the invitation and our flyers through our listserv.
Great. Thanks, Maritza. Nikki just left a comment here about an article that she wrote on strategic narratives, and she's looking for input. Any other announcements? Mohsen, I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier in your introduction to yourself, Mohsen again is in Iran and is a cultural sociologist. I'm wondering if you are looking for cultural diplomacy partners. I seem to get that suggestion from your introduction.
Thank you, dear Paul. I will share my CV or social accounts with others.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you are looking for, we'd love to encourage collaboration here as part of our meetings. And so for those of you who are, well, and particularly I'm thinking particularly in countries where there are kind of tense relations, it would be great to foster citizen diplomacy collaborations. Anybody else? All right, we are at 10:30, which is the time to end our meeting. I want to thank everybody. Actually, if you're able to and willing to kind of open up your video briefly, for those of you who haven't opened up your video, I'd much appreciate being able to take a photo of many of you so that we can share it with the wider world. So if you, Jeff, Nikki, Tasneem, Musa, Elizabeth, Colton, Michael Anderson, et cetera, and so forth. If you can open up your videos, that would be fantastic. And smile for the camera. Thank you. And let me do that again one more time just to share the full list of people here. And Nikki or Musa and Gulya, if you can open up your videos, that would be great. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your time and your participation. We look forward to seeing you in early June at our next meeting.
Thank you, everybody.
Hopefully
Bye,
see you
everybody.
soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
Paul.